Greetings and salutations. This is Abdelhadi with The Bitter Truth, where we may not have all the answers, but we're going to ask an awful lot of questions. You can also visit us at thebittertruth.info, I-N-F-O, and you can get some fabulous swag there to make your life better. And you can also support the show, which we appreciate. As you know, most of these shows don't take big ad dollars because I guess, big peace and, big free medical is not a good industry or a lobbying group for me. But I am very excited. I have friend of the show. He got his company Anthropos Games got a great shout out in a Wired magazine article. And I learned a bunch of stuff reading that article because I'm not really a gamer in any sense. And so I brought him on to talk about the gaming culture and everything else. Calvin Johns has a PhD in anthropology, focusing in alternate reality games, which is interesting because had he been doing this during the current time phase, I think he could have invented a few more games. Calvin, how are you doing?
I am doing great today, Abe. How are you?
I'm great, man. Thanks for coming on. When I got that article, I was like really stoked that you guys got a shout out in that. That was really bitching. So let's kind of jump into it. I'm not a big gamer person, as you know, because we are friends in the interest of transparency. But I didn't know that D&D was so recent, like a 1970s thing. And then I only played it once or twice in the 6th grade and lost interest. And so I didn't know these issues that were part of that gaming culture. But apparently there's like a lot of racist tendencies, right?
Yeah, I think there's, you could talk about the culture itself and what that would be like when it comes to, gaming stores. You can picture like the comic book stores and some of the stereotypes out there of, they're not always inviting to women or to people of color. So we could talk about that cultural stuff too. Also, just the game itself has some sort of things, built into it. Things that come from the beginning of fantasy literature and stuff like that. So when Dungeons and Dragons was published in 1974 with that first edition, a lot of the original writing, the different races, monsters, peoples of the game, were taken from fantasy literature, like Tolkien would be, sort of that number one source, and a lot of very Eurocentric sort of definitions of fantasy, and then just hodgepodge borrowings from other world cultures, right? So that would have been 74. And then since 1974, new editions of the game have come out, and the company has changed hands. And so after Dungeons and Dragons, like 3.5 was a big edition of the game that lasted for several years. Then the company was bought by the owners of Magic the Gathering. If you remember that card game that was, taking over school lunchrooms by storm. And the developers of that game, Wizards of the Coast, had made enough money to say, hey, we're going to buy Dungeons and Dragons, which, wasn't really the top game at the time. They had White Wolf was a company. The Storyteller system was around. Pathfinder, other games had sort of eclipsed D&D, but it really got a whole new surge in popularity with this 5th edition. And now you've got celebrity players, you've got Twitch TV, you've got live shows, you've got famous actors and voice actors. You've got Vin Diesel playing it on set with Dame Judi Dench and things like that. And so it's become a huge cultural phenomenon again, just recently, since this 5th edition came out just a few years back.
What was the big difference with the 5th edition and the previous editions to make it such a big deal?
Well, it was just more the product itself. They got a really good launch. The game streamlined a lot of things. They did a big advertising push. Wizards of the Coast was a huge company. They'd kind of put D&D on the back burner. And when other games were, making money, they said, hey, maybe we should pull this game out again, right? Role playing was kind of as a hobby was picking up and becoming more popular. And so they really jumped on that when the iron was hot, put out this huge game that's now, again, like it was back in the 70s and 80s, the center of the hobby again. So the content really hasn't changed. I mean, this stuff has been around for ages.
Sure.
It's just now with, the world being more conscious of things, a lot of the players are like, hey, like, when are you going to get this stuff out? Right? It's more like, when are you going to take this out of the game? And that's what's surprising. Kind of everyone knew it was always there. Home games can do what they want. If you're playing with a group of friends, there is no canon, there is no video game. Like, you make it up as you go, right?
Right.
And so, people are just kind of like, when are you going to take these things about orcs? Like, when are you going to take some of this stuff about the whole like racism between elves and dwarves that you thought was so fun? Like, can we get rid of that yet? Like, people are just really ready to move past that. And obviously, the titans of industry and large companies, are slow to move.
Sure.
Yeah.
Well, and then, kind of to your point, I guess kind of feeds into my next question. How ready do you see this community, the role-playing community, which is kind of what this is, Dungeons and Dragons and companies like yours, versus the video game community? Is there like a difference demographically, or I mean, what do you see?
Yeah, I mean, culturally, I mean, there's overlap. With the video game culture now, you have, esports are really big, and you have games that are, more about sport, more about competition. Things like Call of Duty or sort of team shooter games, these massively multiplayer online games that are very technically challenging, and a lot of the pleasure then comes from being good at them.
Right.
And then you have a whole field of games where, like the Japanese role-playing games like Final Fantasy and things you may have heard about, where it's not the technical part of the game that's hard. It's the story that's so engrossing. And, a lot of people play both. Some people only play the sports type games, the competitive type games, and they don't really play the story games. Some people overlap. Some of those groups would overlap with the tabletop gamers, some don't. So the culture, I would say, moving things along, we could have whole conversations about video games. The new Cyberpunk game came out with, some troublesome issues there and stuff. The video game industry has its own issues, I think, to work through. And while the cultures might overlap a bit, I think it would be a really different conversation with the kinds of things they're struggling with and what, I say struggle, but the resistance that they have to progress over there would be related, but a different conversation.
Sure. So what like you mentioned earlier before we started recording that there was a few observations you wanted to kind of get into and kind of take it from there. What were some of your thoughts coming in?
Yeah, sure. Well, I think the article did a good job. I'm sure you'll have a link to it. Folks can check that out. But the real point was like, in the way that specifically, then the example would be orcs. In the way that this fantasy world of Dungeons and Dragons has defined orcs as playable characters and also as monsters, it really just sort of reinforces and reinscribes real world racism in just a really sort of unsettling and unpleasant way to a lot of people, right? I mean, whether you're a person of color yourself or whether you're a progressive minded person, it's just really unsettling. And so the article just kind of mentions that. It works through, I think, some pretty cool scholarly sources. Like you said, it gave us a shout out, and we can talk about what our game Early Dark did.
Yeah.
That had it referenced in the article maybe a bit later on. But I think what the article doesn't do is maybe sort of specify the different levels of what you might consider racism in a game like Dungeons and Dragons, or how it's reinforcing racism. And so just real quickly, I thought I'd maybe bring up, those three different levels, and then just see what you want to talk about most, Abe.
Yeah, sure, man.
So that first one is the idea that orcs, let's use orcs. That's the example you picture. You've probably seen Lord of the Rings. You've seen these big sort of hulking green-skinned monster types become sort of like the default fodder enemies in a lot of fantasy campaigns, thanks to J.R.R. Tolkien and the Lord of the Rings. But, sort of like the surface level, or maybe not that it's superficial, but that it's literally on the surface, is just how these cultures are then sort of modeled after non-white cultures. You can see examples of this even going back to like the World of Warcraft video game, where the big green skinned trolls had like a Jamaican accent, right? Or think of like Jar Jar Binks in Star Wars. And it's like, why are you making these like these non-humans act very closely like non-white or non-European or non-global North cultures, right? So there's that level where it's purely like, hey, like your orcs kind of look like, either, like in that case, it was like this Jamaican sort of feel, right? Like you did that on purpose, right? So there's that level, just similarities that these writers have used, or sort of borrowings that they've done to try to make this monster exotic, which obviously doesn't play with a lot of folks, right?
Right.
There's the second level then with the idea of the monster, and orcs are monsters, but in later editions of the game, they become playable. So you can sort of be one and like, try to role play it, but they're still evil and they're still monsters. And so it's kind of this idea of, what are monstrous people like? And you get at like Tolkien sort of even like in developing his orcs, how he described them. He used the term mongoloid, right? Wow. Like in a letter. Yeah. I mean, he was writing about the Hun, like this villain, right? And you can imagine Hun, being a word that was used even to describe Nazism too, right? I mean, it kind of had become this like bad, this, I guess, like metaphor maybe, or image, right? Of like the villain.
Well, that was
free world.
Well, that was anti-German World War I propaganda, man. The Hun is coming.
Yeah. And so, and he took it that step farther to, yeah, to literally using the word mongoloid, right, in descriptions. And so I guess that second level is this idea of constructing a monster.
Okay.
And why you need monster. And really in the game, then you have to make, well, you don't have to. One of the ways you can do this is you just make them evil, right? If you think of like the video game Doom, you're just shooting demons, blowing stuff up. You want to blow stuff up. You want to murder people. So you need bad guys. So you have to create monsters. Think of like G.I. Joe and Cobra. Like there's no moral qualms with you playing with your action figures, shooting down Cobra and the bad guys, right?
Sure,
so
absolutely.
The second level, I guess, that I'm describing is this idea of creating a monster that's sort of guiltless murder and what that might mean and how that can tie into views of racism more in the sort of colonial sense, right?
Right.
What does it mean that this game is still focusing on trying to give you an evil person that you can murder and not feel bad? And do we as people want to keep celebrating that when, even though we have so many video games with so many stories that are about that, maybe we should question that too, right?
Sure.
This desire to have this guiltless murder and why it's fun to go around blowing up bad guys and why that sort of like violence becomes the major fantasy, right? That's that second level, monsters and killing.
Mm-hmm.
And then the third level that I think is most interesting, and this is where I think really what it reinscribes the structures of racism. This is a criticism that I really want to engage with,
sure,
most often in conversations with folks, and say, well, the real issue is that they're monsters and they're people. And now that orcs are playable, how can you call them monsters if they're still people? They can still love, they can still have passions, they have a mind, they have intelligence, they have wishes, hopes, dreams, fears. You're making them people, but you're saying they're not human, so they're evil and they're expendable or they're different in a certain way. And the problem with that then is that's literally what racism does in the real world, right?
Well, yeah.
Like we are defining people as monsters or as different, right? So it kind of, I think it's definitely all three of those things together, but they're three really different conversations. That idea of the aesthetic level of sort of modeling or borrowing or making your monsters look like non-white cultures, which is a form of racism for sure. There's that level of just the senseless murder and like the monster is the enemy. And then there's this level of like, yeah, but you're making them people. And now you're teaching kids, or adults, we're role playing. We're playing this game. We're spending hours and hours in this fantasy world, completely reinscribing the myth of racism. So it's not even if orcs are modeled to look like dark-skinned people, or if the trolls have a Jamaican accent, right? It's not just this kind of, brutal parodying or brutal, like violent spoofing. It's also this like literal reenactment of the structures of racism, which is to treat a person as though they are somehow more monstrous or essentially evil, right? It's an essentialist argument about the nature of certain people.
Mm-hmm, mm-hmm. Absolutely. Well, that's the fundamental cog in racism, isn't it? I mean, you don't know these people, and you're told, what science says. I mean, or whatever. I mean, it goes back to shit. You look at what the founding fathers had to say about slavery, and it's the other. I mean, even I remember being 23, 22 years old when Top Gun came out, and I fucking hated that movie. I went and saw it with a couple of buddies, and I was just like, fuck, if that wasn't an ad for joining the Air Force and or B, destroying people without mothers or sisters or fathers, because the Russians had masks on and they talk like Darth Vader.
They did. You're right. They were always masked to make them that monster. That's that second level. Yeah.
Sure. So, I mean, I would love to talk about constructing a monster first, and then just actually all three, and just kind of break into them. But, these games did not make this situation. I mean, they reflect our humanity or lack thereof, I think. So how is it that it's that easy for us? I mean, we construct monsters over fucking football. I got friends that, I got a Minnesota Vikings fan buddy, good guy, good human being, great dude, man. But when the Green Bay Packers come up, it's like, wow. I could put in any race here the way he talks. It's like people from Green Bay are like the devil. And I'm like, so like, let's talk about that for a hot second.
Yeah. I mean, I think that, you said the word too, the other, right? Like the capital O, and you can look at even theories of cultural development or theories of the nation state. I mean, Ben Anderson just springs to mind, right? This really sort of pivotal text in social science. And this idea that to make a nation state, like you need to have a hated other, right? This idea of you have to make tribes and you have to make sort of outsiders to get people to feel like they are together and insiders, right? And you talked about the war propaganda, like obviously that's a huge thing.
Sure.
And so you're right. It goes back, to the point where some folks consider it sort of like a fundamental part of being human. I mean, we could argue about that too. I think how natural to us is this idea of creating monsters, and how much could we actually teach ourselves not to,
right.
In the grand, when could we get to the worlds of Star Trek where that kind of stuff isn't in there in certain ways, right? Gene Roddenberry had a very utopian view of the future. And there's, been problems here and there with those things as well. But, a lot of folks would look to that as, definitely a utopian future where the world becomes one culture. I mean, does that necessitate fascism? I don't know. Again, that might be a different conversation, but, can we get beyond making these hated others? Can we get beyond turning other people into monsters for the sake of propaganda and for the sake of unity? Yeah, I'd like to think so. So
yeah, well, and it also kind of feeds you in your second point. It feeds into the views of murder because, I don't want to get political because I know you've got some limitations, but this last election cycle really pissed me off because we were wholesale ignoring the records of people running for office and didn't care who they killed in the past or who they wrongfully imprisoned in the past, and just looked over that to get to a means. But I'm kind of going, well, gee whiz, if you're a mom in Yemen who lost 3 kids, I don't know if you really give a shit if it was a black president or an orange president or a white president. Right. So it's like, but we justify these views of murder, and we, we have no problem still being in Afghanistan. And, and most people as a culture don't mind what we're doing there in America. Yeah. And so so the view, so let's talk about that for a minute. Cause I mean, obviously we get this shit ingrained like playing Monopoly. You know what I mean?
Yes. Yeah. Yeah. And I think even, the idea of the monster is one form of other that's particular too, right? I mean, the sports other, I think, is a big deal. The whole nature of tribalism, I might say that there is a certain human nature to tribalism. We can just get around it by all becoming one tribe, right? Maybe that's a trite answer to it, but the monster is then something even more particular, right? You mean, we don't have to be like Freudian or Lacanian or something, but but the idea of this fear, right? The boogeyman, this fear of like this other, that's also a danger, that's also a non-human, that's also the great mysterious, the unknown, Cthulhu and the dark lords, and this idea of, Satan, right? This idea of this thing that's out to get you is in a particular form of other, right? It's not just the other team. And you're right, people take things, they can take things to that level with sports and definitely with politics. But the way that, these monsters are construed, and I think you're right, the way that Americans, particularly then as a culture, that idea of American exceptionalism and American superiority that can just really easily manufacture monsters out of other people, especially then for political spin or for political gain, when it's just egregious. Yeah. Right. What some folks are doing. Yeah. And those folks don't get called monsters, right? Like, no, the general isn't the monster. It's somehow the infantry on the other side that's the monster, right? Like, right. Yeah.
Like we seem to be, and again, it's like sports, when the other team makes a touchdown, when I'm with friends of mine watching games and they get mad or the other guy hits a home run, I'm a Dodgers guy. Yeah. I can't get mad. It's his job to hit a home run. Yeah. Like why am I don't hate him. I'm disappointed because I want the Dodgers to win. Yeah. I don't hate that fucking like in California, the Giants Dodgers rivalry is like Arabs and Jews. Right. And so, but I'm like one of the guys that sits there and goes, well, yeah, dude, it's his job. Don't be pissed. Okay, fine.
Yeah, and he did a great job.
He did a great job. Like, that's why they pay him $1 million a minute, right? And so, good for him. And so now, okay, we're at bat. Now it's our turn. And I've been that way for a long fucking time. And so I don't understand why. And I'm not smart. Okay, I almost flunked out of college 3 times. So I don't understand why people can't empathize and go, well, gee whiz, it is his job to make that touchdown, or it is his job to hit a home run, or it is his job to to make that 3-pointer. Yeah. And people getting mad, calling them bastards. I'm going, God damn it. It's like, it's a team. It's just a label made up to sell some merch at the game. And why are you getting so mad?
Yeah. And I think, I remember, I was always I'm from Michigan. We like our Michigan teams. My dad's a big Detroit Tigers fan, and, we'd watch the games, and I was always the kind of guy, maybe when it gets like college age and things like that I would sort of cheer for both teams and everyone would get mad at me. Like I would cheer for, that was a really good play. Like that's what's entertaining to watch. Right. But I admit one time I was hanging out at a little wings bar here in Austin, Texas, gorgeous place. Yeah. And I'm like, hey, I'm going to really care about this football game that's on. I'm going to like let myself get really invested into it. And boy, it is, I mean, it's like watching a reality show, right? Like, why do people watch soap operas? Why do people watch reality TV? It's the same thing, right? You become sort of emotionally connected to something that you're not in control of.
Right.
And that's a rush, right? You're tying it's like gambling, really. I mean, you're just tying your emotions to this fate that you have zero control over. And in some ways that's 100% childish, but then in some ways it's 100% human. And we do it, you just do that in other places, right? You would get a rush out of, other kinds of things. Maybe you get a rush out of swinging that bat and getting out there and doing those things. But yeah, people love it. And again, it's sort of, hopefully there's a harmless form of tribalism also, right? That's sort of temporary or only to a certain level.
Yeah.
Where people can do that.
But to your point, and kind of the reason I brought up that the sport analogy is because the thing that does disturb me, and I wince. I'm squeamish. I don't like injuries, right? But yet I like football. But I don't cheer when the other team got clocked. If the quarter, like a couple weeks back during the playoffs. I'm not a Chiefs guy. But Patrick Mahomes got fucking clocked. I mean, he was taken out of the game and a massive concussion. He looked like he was punched by Mike Tyson. The look on his face was just like, he was out for like 45 seconds or a minute, and they walked him off, and he was out the rest of the game. And I was like, goddamn, hope that kid's okay. But then I saw online, and he's like, yeah, great. And,
way to go.
And then if they do win this game, they'll be out, because this Lenny guy, whatever his name was, he's not gonna no way he's gonna win against the Bills, whatever. And you're sort of going, really? Like, wow, the guy's like 25 years old. Celebrating? Yeah, you're celebrating. The guy might have a concussion or permanent CTE damage or some shit. And you're like, like I like watching football. I like the strategy of it, and I like to watch a good clean hit. But I just want to see anybody get hurt or damaged or dead. And so, this gets kind of to the views of murder. Like how, like, I forgot the line in Shakespeare, hath not a Jew eyes, hath not a Jew. Yeah. What play I'm talking, which play I'm
talking
about?
Merchant of Venice?
Yeah.
The Merchant of Venice?
Yeah. And it's just like, we're all human. When you see a little baby, it's a little baby. It's got legs and lungs and somebody loves it. Right. How is it that is this easy for us to construct these views of murder and be okay with it?
Yeah. And I think that's a great tie-in, like back into like that role-playing game, right? I mean, just these notions of sort of re-inscribing and reteaching folks to view certain people as monsters, right? Or to practice that when they're people. And, if creating monsters is cool. If you have a monster that's literally a monster, if you have the dragon, you have the Rancor from Star Wars, you have the troll, you have Grendel, if you have these monsters, like, yeah, let's have a hero go kill them. We could talk again about why we like the consequences of such violent fantasy, and that's how masculinity is defined. And totally, we could do critiques on that. But when it comes to race, like, that doesn't necessarily bring in any racism. That's just a monster, and we want to kill it because we're heroes. Okay. But when you make the monsters people and you give them a brain and you have them potentially be, people around the table, that's when it just gets into that where you have to do that double think, where they are a person. This orc is a person, but in the world of the game, they're still a monster, right? And so it's that idea of, I don't imagine a lot of folks at the table are yelling hateful, racist things at other players in their home game if there's those 5 friends are sitting around the table, right? Like, the criticisms of Dungeons and Dragons is not that you'll have a friend start using slurs against, people at a table or something. I mean, that can happen in conventions and in public play, and there's safety tools in place and things for that. But the issue is still that we are reinscribing this notion of this duplicitous thinking where some person can be both a person and a monster at the same time. Right. And so I think and we could argue again what it means to violently want to slay monsters, but let's say that's okay. Let's say it's okay to kill Grendel. It's not okay to kill this orc that's talking to me. Right. Like, and even think about, children's cartoons where everybody's an animal or something. And you're like, the adults kind of chuckle like, oh, that's a lion talking to a gazelle. Like, what are they eating in this world? You can think about the limitations and sort of the shortcuts of bad fantasy. Or not well thought out fantasy. And people are just saying D&D, like, you just haven't thought it out. Like, sure, we can ignore this racism. Yes, we can play the game and ignore it. It's just lazy, bad fantasy for you to do this. It just reinscribes too much. This way of thinking. So yeah, I mean, I think, that murder aspect of it, really becomes an issue when you tie it to what's, people. Orcs are people in D&D now. They have lives and thoughts and villages.
Right. See, but that's the thing is like, kind of gets into the final point about dehumanizing the other. There's a thing in most armies, they have this issue with fraternizing with the enemy, right? So if you're running a POW camp, you're not supposed to be fraternizing with the prisoners, right? Because why? Because, the American guy or the Egyptian guy or whoever, shows the French dude a picture of his girlfriend, and the French guy's, she's hot. And he's like, I can't wait to get home. And, picture of the kids. And then they start talking about rugby, and all of a sudden they got shit in common. And now the guy's a friend. It's like, now the French guy has to, he's got to execute this guy. He's like, I kind of don't want to. And he's a good dude. I mean, he's got a girlfriend and he's got 2 babies and blah, 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 blah. Right.
Yeah.
So so that's why you don't fraternize with the enemy, because it keeps them inhuman. If you're an American prisoner of war camp and you got a bunch of krauts, POWs, it's okay to keep them krauts. But as soon as the guy shows his picture of his wife who looks like Claudia Schiffer, and the guy's like, oh man, here's my girlfriend. Hey, I can't wait to get back home. Where are you from?
Yeah.
I'm from Munich. And then the guy's, I'm from Wisconsin. And start talking about beer. And all of a sudden they got a beer thing. Oh yeah, I like this beer. Like that. And then now they're buddies, right? Can't shoot your buddy.
And that's literally, I mean, sometimes that word's considered a slur, right? Like the point of slur is then the slur. A lot of people say words don't matter. Like, well, they kind of do, in that slur is part of that dehumanizing.
That's right.
That paves the way for murder.
That's right.
Right. Like, and that's why there's certain words I don't say, as a white person, like, is there magic to these words? No, but it's just understanding like, hey, if we're going to have rules in society, let's make rules. I will gladly follow some rules when it comes to sort of demonstrate through resistance, then the power of slurs and the power of dehumanizing language. Right. Because you're right. That's the point of it. The point of it is to make murder easy. How about I don't use words that have literally been created just to make murder easy? Like, wow. And so, that's, and I guess, different historically, then some words are going to last longer than others, right? Like maybe things against Germans nowadays, Germans, don't feel that continued dehumanization in the States. Right. And so that's not a bad, that's not a bad word anymore.
Right. But, and then even still, if they've at least, because they've done so much work, I think, on not forgetting what they did. Right. They don't have Nazi flags flying around, but you go to a museum, you can see that shit, and they teach it in school. Hey, here's what we did. Here's where we fucked up, and let's not do it again. Right. And whereas here in the States, we had, like you mentioned, American exceptionalism a few minutes back. We have this tendency to just want to gloss over things and sweep it under the rug and go, well, that was in the past. It's like, well, it's still kind of a big past.
Yeah. And I mean, and it's both, right? I mean, it's the idea of atrocities that happened in the past, the US being just such a huge committer of atrocities, right? And the fact then that they've happened in the past is true, but it's not. And arguments about restitution and arguments about making up for the past are arguments that need to be had. Sure. Sometimes folks don't, a lot of privileged, like white folks, a lot of privileged people in the US don't get that it's not just the past. It's not just it's like literally still happening now. The material effects are still now. The inherited wealth because of GI Bill limitations, for example, even like this one stretch of road here in Austin, right? Just on the east side by that Fiesta Mart, right? There are all these old concrete homes, all the exact same shape and size that were, particularly for veterans and stuff. People of color weren't allowed to, to get those sort of benefits if they served in the military, and things like that. That's right. That's just a generation ago. It's literally one generation ago.
See, and that was that chicken shit Truman thing too, because when the GI Bill was written, that was the big problem with the southern states. They didn't want to, honor black veterans. So Truman went ahead and made it a states' rights issue. You can administer it as you see fit, right? And that's why, like in California, how
diplomatic,
right? And that's why, like, and I'm not saying California is so progressive, but that's why California was able to, the access to the GI Bill was much easier for people of color in California than say it was in Texas or Georgia.
Yeah.
And so that was a Truman deal. But again, it gets back to, that's an easy thing to do, to dehumanize people, make them the other. And then like you keep them away from you. And then if you keep them away from you, then it's easy to kill them.
Yeah. And you're right. I mean, all these layers sort of come together, just, then that notion of like, because if you look at how racism then is, it's an institution, of harming non-white bodies and stuff in the United States, right? That has a long history. And part of that work then is like literally everyone is, like you said, talking about beer or sharing stories, or, even in, you have obviously more segregated areas of the country, sure. And even, of a city or of a state or something like that too. But everyone's gonna like, we are all people, and everyone's gonna figure that out to some extent, right? Like, you don't have to do work to convince people that people who don't look like you are human. Children are very, very good at recognizing humans. Like maybe they play with a dog
right.
and they really love their stuffed animal, but humans aren't, you don't have to teach that kid to be pleasant or to be accepting. Again, I'm not making universal claims about human nature. Anytime someone does that, they're generally wrong. So I'm not trying to make a deep theoretical claim here, but racism has to be taught, I guess, is the point, right? And it's inscribed in certain ways. And so even something as little as the Dungeons and Dragons role-playing game that you literally can ignore their racism and play it a different way if you want, it's not just then reflecting our problems and the racism of the society of the folks making the game. It is doing that, but it's not just that. It's literally propagating it. It's pushing it forward.
Right.
It's allowing that mode of thinking. It's the mode of, it's not what you think. It's not what people are saying about people. It's not that orcs, the idea of orcs have, a different like texture of hair, right? And you can be, hey, it kind of looks like you're trying to represent people of color. Okay, that's an issue. And that can be addressed, I think, in certain ways, right? Like, was it an homage? Is it on purpose? Is it not? Is it a metaphor? Is this like X-Men where we can actually talk about racism through this idea of the mutant or something, right? Like, is it that? Fine, maybe that's, different fiction can have other races that look like real world cultures, and they're doing it progressively, right? Like that in and of itself isn't the issue. I mean, it is for D&D, but it doesn't have to be, right?
Right.
But then beyond that, it's just that whole mode of thinking that's so wrong that, like, for me, for example, myself, I can't even play in it. It's like I'm watching a sci-fi film, and let's say, everyone in the universe is blind. Everyone is, can't see visually, and yet they still have signs and like propaganda on the walls in some scene. I'd be like, is anyone catching this? This is just not. Like, how is, like, it's not matching up. Your sci-fi is bad sci-fi. Your fantasy is bad fantasy, right? It's not realistic. I'm breaking immersion. It's lazy, and you've seen these, right? Like even, some episodes of Black Mirror, that great sci-fi show on Netflix, are so riveting because they're so good at not being lazy. Right. They're so good at taking that idea and pushing it like so far to the extreme to be, to really think through these issues, to show how, having a live tracker where you can, what is it in that famous episode from that first season where you can like rate people, you bump into someone on the street and you're like, oh, sorry. And you like rate them live, like right there, right? It's like the social media like becomes ubiquitous. And like, all the problems that could lead to, that's good sci-fi. Something where you're literally imagining people as monsters and they get a -2 to intelligence. Like you roll your intelligence in D&D. It's like, oh, but you're an orc, so you have -2 intelligence. Like intelligence is not biological. If you are a human, you have the same capacity for intelligence. It's hereditary, not genetic, right? Like you can inherit, you can be taught, and you can inherit through lifestyle.
That's right.
Just like you can inherit money, you can inherit, certain habits or disposition towards being an acquisitive mind or something, right? It's not genetic. There's no dumb group. There's
no dumb gene, right? Absolutely.
There's no dumb gene. And it's just so hard to see that and just be like, come on, D&D, like you're being lazy.
Right. I get it. Well, hey man, listen, I know we're coming up on a hard stop for you, and I appreciate the time so far. Is there anything you want to kind of leave the listeners with? Are you working on a new project, or what's going on?
Oh yeah. I mean, in the game space, I guess we can mention that game Early Dark that was mentioned in the article. There's definitely pluses and minuses. We did that as a really sort of progressive project 10 years ago. There are ways when it's out of date now, right? There's things we did with having 3 genders in some of the civilizations to really just sort of push. At the time, it was just, feminist theory that I was teaching at a university and kind of wanted to, tuck into this role-playing game world. We intentionally made those genders sort of biologically reductive to show the discourse on gender as biologically reductive argument. Now, with sort of trans theory, just really calling that into question and pulling that apart, it's kind of a bummer then that game that we came out with 10 years ago, trying to be really progressive in ways of talking about gender, is now out of date, right? There are better arguments out there, and it doesn't really line up with contemporary discourses of things like transness and things like gender. So, we definitely, it's dated in some ways, but in other ways, those cultures are really progressive, and we really tried to, do that work to make those cultures have all those layers to them, right? We have, there's just lots of power systems and like bad systems, you're kind of like oppressed in the game.
Right.
And it's sort of like playing through and against those systems intentionally is sort of, part of the conflict of the game. So yeah, that was our big project, Early Dark, that came out in like 2000. I think we wrote it in like 2010 and 11. It came out in 2011 or 12. The new stuff that we're doing in Anthropos Games there's always, the contemporary conceits in there, right? How progressive can we be? How can we get people thinking in different ways? I do a lot of work, again, I'm a white man. If we put gender stuff in the game, it's contemporary critical academic theory, but I don't try to tell stories for people that I'm not, right? I wouldn't feel comfortable writing a game that's like about the experience of the other, or that's, particularly strongly about gender. But what I can do then, and what we try to do as, the 3 or 4 of us that work on our titles, is play around with agency a lot, have ways of actually challenging the player's agency. So kind of like what we talked about with football, right? You're kind of attached to something that's not up to you,
right?
And how you play with that, how you get people thinking in different ways, how you make them imagine what it would be like, to cognitively function differently,
right?
Is a lot of the kind of play we do. As a neuroatypical person myself, we really try to make games that work with different forms of neurodivergence and, be able to get the people, whose brains just work a little differently, have a space where they can play a game that really makes sense for them too. So, we're always doing stuff, not always about race and gender, just because of our own limitations.
Sure. Well, and kudos to you for acknowledging that, because I mean, like I wrote a novel about 5-6 years ago, or came out 5-6 years ago. I finished it in 13, but I remember one review I read is like, this is such a decidedly male point of view. I'm kind of going, yeah, well, because I'm a dude. I mean, I don't know. I mean,
yeah.
And it was written in the first person, so it's from the point of view of a 23-year-old kid. I'm like, largely based on true story, but I fictionalized the shit out of it. But I'm kind of going, well, I guess I could try to write a story about a woman wanting to become a nun and do that in the first person. I don't know if I'd be any good at it.
And I think, and this is where, I would push you that, yeah, it is true that you wouldn't want to write a story about what it's like for a woman to become a nun, because that's not really a story you can tell. But you could have, multiple characters, or you could have, a guy who's questioning that stuff, or allow you to question that about yourself as you're writing through characters. Sure.
And that's what I attempted to do with the book, was like, I had all these other people coming in and all that, but it still was from like a, first person point of view. And I didn't choose to make it about, a young Palestinian girl who's 11, because I wasn't even raised there. The novel's set in West Bank. So you just kind of work with what you're doing, but you hope, the idea is to, hope to make it a good story that's not going to be like, oh, but we got to do this. Oh, but we got to do that.
Yeah.
Because then you're talking like the movie business, they test market everything, and like, well, what we really need is a black female CEO, because that tests really well. I mean, okay, if it lends itself to the story, or if you're being disingenuous, then that's why you get a shitty movie, right? So,
right. And I guess I just think there's, there's a maybe not happy medium, but there's a way to challenge your male gaze and your male perspective, without being like, well, I guess I have to write a story from a woman's perspective, right? There's that other way of being that sort of critical engagement with the male gaze, which you have, and which I have, right? As
hope so. Yeah.
Ascribed male identity.
I hope so.
I guess I haven't. I mean, I don't know.
I hope so.
But we have these ascribed genders, and so we can explore that, and we can push that in our, like having a man cry in a film or something, right? Just something as easy as like we're beyond that now, right? You've got to do more than that now, right? But there was a time when that was the progressive thing to do, right?
Yeah, absolutely.
And so let's keep doing that, right? Like let's not get lazy. Let's not, just write stories about these male heroes that maybe from even our generations, and our ages are apart, but we could be the same generation or not, I guess, depending on who's counting. But let's have different fantasies. Let's write different fantasies. Let's not rely on that older style of male hero. And what does it mean? How do we relate to our own gender? Knowing that gender is socially constructed, knowing that it's kind of fake in certain ways and then kind of real in others. How much weight do we give it, and how do we play with that? I think that's interesting, right? And that's the space that all this fantasy can do, right? Is open up new ways. And you're right, sometimes you're going to mess up. And we've done that, some of the stuff that, like I said, with that, with our genders in the game, I think they're really great. I think they're really cool. I think they do a good job of talking about the non-binary and gender fluidity and things that, we were literally talking about in class and what I was teaching at the university. But they're out of date now, right? And I just have to sort of admit that and be like, yeah, that was a missed opportunity, I guess, or but what else can we do? What's next? How can we try to just do the best we can do at any moment? And then when we know better, we do better, right? That's like the Maya Angelou quote.
Well, Jesus Christ, dude, God, that was a great way to start wrapping this up because, and in good writing, you just set it up for the sequel, my friend. I'll tell you what, we'll have you back on for sure. No, man, that was fucking great. I really appreciate your time, folks. My guest has been Calvin Johns. He is the founder of Anthropos Games, and you're gonna have the link to the Wired article we were talking about a little bit, and the link to the company, and you can visit there. And again, we're on PayPal and Venmo. Just look me up under Abe Abdelhadi. You can go to thebittertruth.info to support the show. And as always, we appreciate that. And as always, you can listen to stuff for free, absolutely free, on YouTube, Spotify, iTunes, Podcast Addict, you name it, we're on it. And again, if this stuff makes you uncomfortable, it's supposed to. Sleep tight.